And so that's why I'm dubious about the long-term
On
effects.
the personal side, you do research for the Director of Research for the Economic Policy Institute. So what sort of signs are you looking for the effect of the law, say a month, 2, 3, or 4 months out?
It's really tough in that kind of short term. I think what you look for is, one, what happens to after-tax corporate profitability, because that's the part of the law that just changed overnight. I mean, corporate taxes went from the statutory rate from 35% to 21%, and you see that clear as day in the data. Basically, corporations had to pay a much lower rate of taxes on their profits, and you see that jump. And then what you look at over time, I think the real linchpin of the law in terms of its effect on helping a broader group in the economy is what happens to private sector investment. I mean, the entire sort of economic case for why this might be a thing that's good for a broad group of people is it'll spur business investment, and so you look at trends in business investment, and that's what I really am focusing on.
Pete Sepp, those are the sorts of things you're looking at in terms of what the overall effect down the road, 6 months, a year of the 2017 law?
Well, most certainly, because as Josh said, this was geared primarily toward a major reduction in corporate income tax. The other key component is the so-called 100% bonus depreciation, allowing companies to write off upfront many of the investments they might otherwise make without all of the complex depreciation schedules. The problem there, of course, is that's only good until the year 2022. So you already have a clock ticking for many people making investments in corporations and thinking, well, either we need to do it right away or we might as well forget it. And so that's sort of a key defect of laws like these, in that if you don't have a provision that's consistent over time, it becomes all the more difficult to measure in terms of its impact.
What does the National Taxpayers Union do? What's your stand?
We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan citizen group. We believe in tax reductions across the board, but also spending restraint in all areas of government. We think that the administrability of the tax system is as important as things like rates and distributions. And unfortunately, this law, with the exception of a few of the individual provisions, such as shifting people toward the standard deduction, doesn't do much for simplification. And that's an important question. You know, the National Taxpayer Advocate of the IRS estimates a range of possible compliance costs with our system, a low of about $100 billion all the way up to $800 billion a year, including opportunity costs. You can't ignore that. And to the extent we can simplify, especially in areas like the earned income credit, people are going to gain, middle class and working class.
Well, let's see what our viewers and listeners are thinking about on this tax day with Pete Sepp and Josh Bivens. Let's hear from Gary first in Newport, Kentucky on our Republican line. Thanks for waiting, Gary. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, filed my federal, and it seemed like I got a cut there, a break there, but then I filed my state, which they used to have a cap on, I think it was 42,000, that they had a cap on the taxable rate on pensions, but the state of Kentucky lowered that cap, and I ended up having to pay it back. So I kind of broke even on the whole thing if I ever saw any change at all.
Yeah,
Thanks, fellas.
It's important to consider all levels of government as far as the tax burden is concerned. And of course, one particular issue with this law, as with many others on the federal level, is whether states choose to conform their tax codes with changes that are made at the federal level. Many states do what's called decoupling and will, for example, not have a parallel credit or deduction, especially I've seen this in several states for the 20% small business deduction on the personal side.
Josh Bivens, any thoughts for our caller in Kentucky?
Yeah, I do agree. I think it is important for people to think about sort of the tax system overall in this country, so both federal, state, local. And then even at the federal level, we have different kinds of taxes. We've got the federal income tax, which is what today is all about, but we also have the corporate income tax, the payroll tax. And different parts of that system are different in terms of how progressive they are in their incidence or not. And so I think one of the reasons why I'm not a fan of the 2017 law is it looked at one of the most progressive parts of our tax system, the corporate income tax, and decided that was the thing that needed to be cut. And yet it didn't cut, payroll taxes. It obviously didn't do anything for state and local because that's outside federal jurisdiction. But if you're looking at the whole portfolio of taxes that face American families, this law came and said, we're going to reduce the one that actually is paid disproportionately by the richest households, leaving most of the rest of the tax system relatively unchanged. That's a big problem for me. I think a big burden for a lot of people is other parts of the tax system that we did not do anything on.
Headline in NBC News over the weekend, twice as many companies paying zero taxes under the Trump tax plan. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that's the bill, the law, lowered the corporate tax rate from 35 to 21% in its first year. The number of companies paying no taxes went from 30 to 60. Let's hear from Michael in Morris, Illinois. Michael, Independent Line, welcome.
Hi, I have a comment and a question, if you'd bear with me. I'm on Social Security, and back in the 80s, they passed some law, and I think it was Al Gore that actually pushed it over the top. And they take half of your Social Security and count it toward your income. I'm one of the lucky Americans that has a pension. But I had to pay under this new tax cut law $395 more this year than last. And I'm already tapping into my savings every year just to make ends meet. Now, my question is this. We have been giving these tax cuts to corporations and the fat cats since Reagan's time. It's never worked. It's never trickled down. And I'd like your guys to explain to me why, like crazy people, do we keep going and giving tax breaks to people that aren't going to do anything for this economy except buy our politicians?
Appreciate that, Michael. Pete Sepp, you want to take that one?
Well, I'd start out by saying there is a fair amount of research that indicates that higher taxes certainly have negative impacts on economic growth. Tax Foundation reviewed 26 separate pieces of literature done over 2 decades, 3 decades actually, found all but 3 determined there was a negative correlation between high tax rates and economic prosperity. As for the trickle-down effect, well, there's been research going back and forth on the effects of these laws. A lot depends on how they're designed. For one thing, the across-the-board reductions in the 1960s after John F. Kennedy's death were measured at increasing employment by 0.5 to 0.8%. Revenues actually increased to the federal government after enactment of the law versus before. You can't isolate all of those impacts, but the evidence is mixed.
Do you think that the Trump administration learned anything from the Reagan experience?
Not really. I mean, I'd say a couple things. One, I'm mostly with Michael on this one. I think cutting taxes on sort of the richest households is just not an economic strategy that has really paid off. I would say at least under the Reagan administration, they did some very large, they did very large tax cuts, and then they did some increases as well. I think the part of the Reagan tax legacy that has some bipartisan support is the 1986 tax reform, which really did try to do some simplification and cut down avenues for sort of gaming the tax system. I would say the 2017 law learned nothing from that. I mean, it was passed so hastily and with, I think, maybe 1 hearing in Congress, maybe 0. And I think the changes they made to the corporate side have just left huge loopholes all over the place. You mentioned before, twice as many corporations paying 0 taxes the year before. And that's in year 1. I mean, what we know is sort of corporate accountants learn over time how to get more and more loopholes. And if in the first year you already see this hemorrhaging of revenue, I would say they didn't learn any of the sort of good lessons of the Reagan tax legacy. They only took the bad ones, which is try to deliver benefits to the top.
Let's hear from David in San Francisco, on with Josh Bivens and Pete Sepp. Hi there.
Yeah, morning. I'm calling you from the land of hyperinflation. And we've been so exposed to fraudulent numbers for so many years that we're kind of skeptical about America was founded on taxation with representation, that the people who get taxed get to run their own lives. Now, if the super rich don't want to pay taxes and they're not paying taxes, why do we allow them to run our lives? So it's, this is the structure of this current tax plan designed to screw us. So that's my first question. The second one is, how do currency speculators pay taxes?
We'll let you go there, David. Guys, keep that thought for a second. We'll get one more call here from Thomas in Little Blum, Texas. Good morning, Thomas, on our Republican line.
Hi, it's Little Elm, Texas.
Little Elm, go ahead.
Hi. For those people who are working right now, I would suggest that they go to their human resources or employer of their employer and have a percentage taken out, withholding. Well, say 10%, or if you can afford it, 20%. And that will allow you, one, to have more pay in your check after you figure out you can do that. You can have more pay in your check as it is now with the tax law, the new tax law. And with this withholding at a higher rate, you can also have a nice substantial amount of money coming back at the end of the year. Now, for those people like that gentleman who was on retirement with a pension, yeah, that's an earned income additional to your Social Security. However, if he had taken a lump sum, okay, at retirement, he wouldn't have been involved in that because he would have had maybe some sort of medications account that where they would send in a certain amount to his checking account, which would not be counted as an income. Now, I have a PhD in accounting, so I know what I'm talking about, and I know exactly this, every last aspect and dot and colon and comma of this new tax law.
We'll pick up on a couple things you said. Thanks there, Thomas. Pete, Sepp, any thoughts?
Well, this brings up the interesting issue of withholding and refunds. I think probably the worst journalism we saw about the tax cut law in this year has been the hysteria over tracking the weekly average amount of tax refunds and saying, aha, that's got to be because of the tax cut law. A refund on your taxes is simply an overpayment you made to the IRS throughout the year without getting any interest for it. It turns out that the refunds are pretty much about the same this year as they were last year on average. Different people are going to have different experiences. They always do. But the point I think that needs to be made here is the system remains too confusing to too many people and too scary in terms of the IRS coming after them for folks to adjust that withholding to the point where they might come out relatively even at the end of the year. Many people are very nervous about running afoul of IRS penalties for under withholding, so they go the opposite way, and that's a mistake.
So that the idea that caller talked about going into his HR office and changing the withholding there, as Pete said, Sepp said, there are certainly some folks that are afraid of doing that, or at the very least not very knowledgeable about what they should be doing, so they come out even or they get that small refund at the end of the year.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I think all that's right. I don't think I would give people blanket advice to tell their employer to withhold less, because we're all kind of loss averse, and even though like I owed a little bit this year, in my head I know I owed because I just had a little bit of a windfall because I had too little withheld, and yet it still hurts a little because we're human in psychology. So I wouldn't give it as blanket advice, but I think that's right. I think the part of the law that should have been relatively straightforward for HR departments to figure out is how much to withhold from W-2 wages. And so my strong guess is they probably mostly got that right, and so there shouldn't be a big effect one way or the other on there. It's really the people who have more complicated income forms, you know, they own a business, self-employment, things like that. That gets much more complicated.
It's not only tax day, it's the start of the beginning of the appropriations, the budget season on Capitol Hill, and the issue of the debt has come up fairly regularly. I wanted to play you some comments from National Economic Advisor Larry Kudlow about the effect of the 2017 law on the debt. Here's what he had to say just a week ago or so.
One economic indicator that has been bad news recently, and you were very critical of the deficit and the debt levels in the Obama administration. We got a new number, $691 billion deficit in the first half of the fiscal year. We're looking at trillion-dollar deficits. Democrats say a big part of that, or at least some part of it, is the tax cuts. Are the tax cuts paying for themselves?
Yes.
Some experts say absolutely not.
And they always will. They always will.
But we're talking about nonpartisan experts here who have said that it has blown a hole in the deficit.
I have to process that nonpartisan expert part. I'll think about that.
Okay.
But look, interestingly, I just saw February, March, year on year, the federal revenues are coming in when you adjust for a day short in March or a day short in February, about 9%. It's a good number. Revenues are really coming in nicely. I believe what will happen here is, as a share of GDP, which is I really think you have to look at these things in relation to the economy, you will see the deficit on a steady glide path lower. Same for the overall publicly held debt.
Pete Sepp, based on what you heard from Larry Kudlow and other research or knowledge that you have, will the tax cuts pay for themselves?
Pay for themselves? No, I don't think so. I do think that the economic growth generated by tax cuts can certainly offset what the so-called budget scorekeepers would call static revenue losses. I mean, the term dynamic analysis is a way of building in economic growth effects, the response of individuals and businesses to incentives such as reduced rates or full expensing of your investments. There have been some estimates, for example, that the long-term revenue loss dynamically from the tax cut law is about $500 billion as opposed to even $2 trillion. I think it's somewhere in between there. You can't discount the economic impacts, but paying for themselves is a bit of a stretch.
Is there thinking that the corporate tax cuts are going to fire up more hiring and those revenues from those taxpayers? Is that what he's talking about? They're growing the federal tax revenue that way.
I mean, there's pretty much two channels through which they could affect the economy. One is sort of a short-run channel, basically just giving people in the economy more money to spend. So as dividends go up, as stock buybacks boost share prices, people feel richer, they spend more money, sort of a stimulus effect. I think that the tax cut had very limited stimulus effects for a couple reasons. One, it directed a lot of money toward the top, people who don't tend to spend every last penny they get because they've got a lot of money anyway. And two, the economy didn't need a ton of short-run stimulus by the time the tax cut ran into it. It had some effect, but not a ton. I think what he is referring to in the sort of traditional defense of something like a corporate rate cut has been long-run effects, and it's the idea, we've talked about this before, maybe it induces businesses to undertake a little more tangible investment in plant and equipment. That increases productivity, which hopefully increases wages of workers, and then those higher wages pay more in taxes, and so you get revenue over time. I think there's very little evidence that that long-run dynamic has happened yet. I'm skeptical it ever comes to pass, but that is the hope that over time, that's where you get more revenue and how they're sort of partially self-financing. It has not happened yet.
So you mentioned people at the top. We read an article earlier about the potential effect of the loss of the state and local income tax on some states that were writing about New York and potentially California, certainly other states. How do you see that playing out?
I think how that plays out a couple ways. I would say one is, I think, so this is a cap on sort of the state and local taxes that you can write off on your federal income tax return. I assume that.
Yes, yeah, right.
And that was part of the law. And that was part of the law that actually raises revenue because it's a cap on a deduction that people used to take in an unlimited way. I think from a state and local government perspective, that makes it a little harder for them to raise taxes because in the past, New York could raise taxes on its residents and say, that may hurt a little bit, but you get to write it off on your federal, so it doesn't hurt as much as you think. And so I think over the long run, that can put a little bit of a strain on fiscal resources that states can raise. On the other hand, it's a pretty inefficient way to help states raise resources. Like we could just increase federal aid to states directly rather than allowing this sort of bank shot of state and local tax deduction. So I think it's a standalone way to finance a generally flawed tax cut. I'm not a big fan of that SALT deduction. I think, in the long run, we probably should figure out better ways to get aid from the federal government to state governments.
Let's hear from a caller in one of those states. We have David Buchanan, New York, on our Democrats line.
Hello. My name is David McAvoy. Two questions or comments. The standard tax or standard deduction is only $12,000, and an extra $1,300 for seniors and so forth. My other thing is, if you give more than $15,000 to an individual, you have to fill out what's called a Form 709. It's a gift tax. In 2017, the maximum gift tax was about $5.5 million that you could give away. In 2018, each individual is allowed to give away over $11 million. It went from $5.5 million to $11 million from one year to the next year. You know who is going to benefit from that. That's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Bye now.
Pete Sepp, any thoughts on what he had to
Well,
say?
those were part of the changes of the tax cut law to the estate and gift taxes. The state tax exemption rose rather dramatically. The whole point of the inheritance and gift taxes has been to try to redistribute wealth and reduce inequality. The evidence is mixed on that. It's why folks like Bill Gale from Brookings Institution have suggested, well, maybe we need to raise the exemption from the tax, index it to inflation, make some other adjustments so that it's not quite as distortionate on medium-sized family-owned businesses. We've moved toward that direction. There are some economists who would suggest that in the long run, for the revenue it raises, it might be worth getting rid of entirely. Congress didn't do that. That debate will continue.
We've talked about the corporate rates being reduced. How will small businesses do and small mom and pop businesses do under this law?
Well, the corporate tax rate really doesn't apply to most of your mom and pop businesses. They're subchapter S corporations, they're sole proprietorships that file through the 1040 system. In fact, upwards of about 50,000 so-called C Corps, the ones who pay the corporation income tax rate, have been migrating out of that system year after year. That's an annual basis, and they've been forming their businesses in other types of structures. And
let's go to Jackson, Tennessee, and hear from Ed on the independent line. Hi there.
Good morning, y'all.
Morning.
The tax system is not crippling our business around the world, said Warren Buffett. It is health care. In 1960, corporate taxes were 4% of GDP. Now today it's about 2% of GDP. Health care was about 5% of GDP in the 60s. Now it's 17.6% of GDP. As Buffett says here, it's not taxes. That's an impediment. It's a distraction. It is health care cost. We spend $3.6 trillion per year. $1 trillion of that is wasted. We should have more money. We should not be cutting taxes for the wealthy. I mean, to me, it is insanity to cut these taxes. And then you can just trust but verify these numbers.
Appreciate that, Ed. Josh Bivens, any thought?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, I would say on the first point that sort of the U.S. corporate tax rate before the 2017 law was not an impediment to U.S. corporations doing business. I totally agree with that. I think there are a lot of claims that the U.S. corporate tax rate was somehow hurting our competitiveness in a global economy. It's not true. It's not true for a couple reasons. You know, one, 35% was the statutory rate. Most corporations, after they got their accountants involved, paid a lot less than that. And then I think he raises a good point. We've got other pressures on American working families in this economy, healthcare, low wages. How come we spent all this time fixing the alleged problem of insufficient corporate profitability through the tax code? That does seem like looking at the wrong place for relieving economic stress felt by most people.
We talked a good bit of callers have talked a good bit about the so-called rich not paying their fair share. Here's some of the frustrations that the Pew Research Center found in their latest report on the tax year. Top tax frustrations, feeling that some corporations and wealthy people don't pay their fair share. Not surprising, feeling that some corporations don't pay their fair share, 60%. Feeling that some wealthy people don't pay their fair share, 60% as well, 62% on that top line number. Potomac, Maryland, Mary on the independent line. Hi there.
Yes.
Good morning.
Hello, yes. I'm calling to just mention that I belong to a club, mostly it's a women's club. 11 out of 19 people have realized after paying their taxes, they're mostly Republican women, and they feel that they have paid a lot more than last year, and we feel like the working class has been hoodwinked this trickle-down economics is a total con game. This tax cut is only making 1% of the rich even richer, and as it's adding $2.5 trillion to the deficit. And we feel that Larry Kudlow is a liar, just like Trump. And Mitch McConnell and Trump and the Republicans have done this common working class no good.
And Mary, your own experience in terms of your own tax bill, more than you expected in terms of what you're paying this year? Less of a refund?
My husband does the taxes, and I think he definitely mentioned that we are not getting the deduction that we got last year. So the deduction is a lot less.
Okay, Mary in Potomac. Pete Sepp, any thoughts?
Well, I think it would be good to put this into perspective. Even the Congressional Budget Office says that our tax system, as it currently stands, is progressive. And in fact, OECD data suggests that the industrialized nations around the world suggests that our tax system, even in comparison with many other countries, is highly progressive. We lean very heavily on the top 10th of earners to finance a great deal of our government. CBO says the top 1% pay an effective federal tax rate, all-inclusive, income, payroll, excises, and whatnot, of about 33%. That's the most recent data. That's down 2 points from 1979. The bottom fifth of earners, on the other hand, they pay less than 10% effective tax rate, in fact, about 5%, and that's way down from 1979. Now, if you want the system to be more progressive, okay, sure. But to say that it's not progressive currently, no, the facts don't support that, and the fact that we have individuals getting away with paying low tax bills doesn't really change the overall picture.
Here's Johanna in Damascus, Maryland, Democrats line. Welcome.
Yes, I wanted to mention, well, that lady sort of stole my thunder, but I remember an old cartoon where Wimpy would say, I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today, and I feel like that's what's going on with this new tax code. Two things. One is this whole idea that the deficit is exploding under Trump. The debt is going way up, and at some point or other, somebody's going to have to pay for it. So that's one thing. The second thing is that it's all about me now. It's not about us. And so all the departments, federal departments, are being drastically slashed, and to a dangerous point, including the Agriculture Department. You had somebody on from the National Farmers Union the other day. The Agriculture Department, Homeland Security, everything is being drastically cut. So we have less money to operate, to do the kinds of things that we need to do in the federal government. And then the people who are at the lowest end of the economic strata are really getting hit hard. The people that can least afford it have a higher tax burden and not as many services. So I'd like you to address those two things. I think they're both very important.
Okay, Johanna, thanks for that. Josh Bivens.
Yeah, I mean, so I totally agree. In the long run, if we want to have an effective government that actually provides vital services for a broad range of people, we're going to need to tax people more. And to me, the natural place to look for more money to start is sort of the top 1% and 5% that have just seen hugely disproportionate income gains over the past generation. We've seen a bunch of money accumulate up at the very top as it's been redistributed there, and yet we tax it a bit more lightly. I would say on the issue of the deficit, economically, I'm not that concerned about the deficit right now. Like, I look at long-term interest rates, they're awfully low. I do think politically the increase in the deficit is often utilized in a really cynical way. You've got a group of people, Republicans in Congress, who just passed a $1.5 trillion deficit finance tax cut, and then literally in the president's budget this year, they scream about deficits being too high and call for steep cuts in programs that benefit a large group of people. And so that to me is the worry about the political uses of deficit. So economically they don't scare me that much. Politically, they are always used as a cudgel to beat back services for a broad range of people, and yet they never seem to be in play when we're talking about tax cuts for the rich.
That caller brought up folks on the low end of the income scale. I think Pete Sepp had mentioned the earned income tax credit earlier in our conversation. There's a report out by ProPublica here in Axios. They're Vox.com rather, with America's anti-poor tax audits in one infuriating map. They write that you would think that the IRS, in an effort to bring in more money, would focus primarily on auditing wealthy taxpayers. But as ProPublica's Paul Kyle and Jesse Eisinger found in a disturbing piece from late last year, recipients of the Earned Income Tax Credit, one of the U.S. biggest anti-poverty programs, aimed almost exclusively at the working poor, were twice as likely to be audited as people earning $200,000 to $500,000. And I'll raise this up to show the map of the audits, which basically shows a large swath of the southeast to the desert west and the west coast. Pete Sepp, remind us again of the Earned Income Tax Credit.
Yeah,
Who gets that? What's it for?
I actually talked with the reporters on this story, and there's really two issues. One they don't cover very well, one they do. The Earned Income Credit was a program created over 3 decades ago, actually, designed to offset the income and later the payroll taxes that working families are liable for. It's an anti-poverty program, pretty efficient administratively compared to things like the SNAP program, for example. One problem with the Earned Income Credit is the obsession, really, with improper payment rates. There are improper payments in the program, but recently it was discovered, for example, that by holding these credits at the IRS while they verify income and eligibility, many families are being deprived of a very important short-term source of cash, and it turns out that about 40% of the earned income credits the IRS withheld were improperly withheld themselves in the name of trying to detect improper payments. We have a genuine problem with over-auditing in that program. We have a genuine problem, too, with the simplicity of that program. If you are able to claim a child tax credit, for example, you should be able to claim the Earned Income Credit under the same rules. You can't right now. That's why there's a lot of confusion in the program.
I want to play for both of you the comments of Charles Rettig, the IRS commissioner. He was asked about this auditing by Senator Wyden, and the issue came up at a hearing, a Senate Finance hearing, I believe, last week. Here's what he had to say.
I want to ask you now about Earned Income Tax Credit recipients being more likely to get audited and millionaires being less likely to get audited. You heard me go through, the numbers and this. I just think it's shameful that poor folks in Humphreys County, Mississippi, have the highest audit rate, in America. But if you're, a high flyer or somebody running a shell company, you're not as likely to get audited. Earned income tax credits audits make up a higher percentage of total audits since Republicans have taken the budget axe to IRS. So here's my question. My question is it really the intent of the Internal Revenue Service to audit taxpayers who are struggling to make ends meet while increasingly letting millionaires and multinational corporations off the hook?
No.
Is that the intent of the agency?
No.
What are you going to do about it?
We're looking at the Earned Income Tax Credit. The part of the problem with the statistics and where you are is there's an $18.4 billion overpayment each year associated with the Earned Income Tax Credit. We want to work with Congress. We're going back to see every proposal that's happened, I believe, since 1975 to reduce the complexity in the credit. The majority of the issues revolve around the definition of a qualifying child. We would hope that working with Congress, we can come up with a better application or an understanding and acceptance that this is a social program. And
I told the chairman like him I'd set an example of staying within my 5 minutes. Look, this, in my view, the stark contrast between the fact that the poorest and most vulnerable get audited more than these multimillionaires is yet more hard evidence that the tax system is stacked in favor of the wealthy.
Josh Bivens, it sounds like both Senator Wyden and the IRS commissioner agree on one thing, that there are issues with the Earned Income Tax Credit and the auditing of people who are getting that.
Yeah, I think I think there's two issues as well. I mean, on the one hand, I think we need a much better resourced IRS. I mean, even the Congressional Budget Office says every dollar you give the IRS actually saves the government money because they're able to do enforcement and bring in more dollars. But then we need a radical reorientation of the priorities of IRS enforcement. As that story showed, it's pretty shocking how much they are focusing on a swath of people, not only are struggling and don't have time to deal with this, but there's not a lot of money there. Whereas there's a lot of money in sort of the various loopholes and accounting shenanigans undertaken by the top 1% in corporations, and that is where most of the IRS enforcement attention should be, and it has not been recently.
Quick comment from PSEP. Go ahead.
The thing where the authors of the ProPublica article got it wrong was in the audit rates of the largest companies. For example, $20 billion of cash flow a year, the audit rate there is 58%. So it's not as if the IRS isn't looking at these companies. The other thing is, a large portion of the tax gap on the individual side of the $290 billion estimated, almost half of that.
Thank you! Thank you, Washington, D.C.! Yay, gang! Yay, gang! Thank you all. Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo! Yes! 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 Holy crap! Thank you, Washington, D.C. Thank you. You all are beautiful. Thank you, Washington, D.C. It is incredible to be here with you all. How many of you saw the CNN town hall last night? Yeah, the Yang Gang gets bigger every single day. And you all are what I call early adopters, my favorite kind of people. You're the people who discover things early, but the Yang Gang's about to go mainstream. So we're standing here, shadow of the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial. And this is a time, I came here for the first time, I was in 8th grade. How many of you all had a trip to DC in 8th grade? Remember that? It was like one of the first times you were going anyplace overnight with your classmates, and you're all nervous, and you're trying to find roommates, so just prove you had friends. And then they bring you here, and you go to the Lincoln Memorial, and it sinks in. Like, even when you're young, you actually get it. You get the gravity of what the country went through, and then the man who helped bring us back together. I brought my family here to the Lincoln Memorial just a couple of months ago for President's Day. My kids are only 6 and 3, so I don't think that they got it, but they definitely did not get it. But we get it. Am I right? Now, this country is going through major problems, not like Civil War level problems, thank goodness, but serious problems nonetheless. Now, I am not a career politician, as most of you know. I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a problem solver, and I'm here to solve the problem that many Americans have been struggling with for the past 2+ years, and the problem is this: why is Donald Trump our president? Now, if you go to the mainstream media and you say, hey, how did Donald Trump win in 2016? What are the explanations that you get? Why do they say that he won? Russia is number one. What else they got? Racism, that'd be number 2. Sexism. Facebook. FBI. Like, these are the explanations that we're getting. But I looked at the numbers. The reason Donald Trump is our president, if you look at the numbers, I appreciate it though, I love it. I love the math signs, I love the math hat. It's Make America Think Harder, am I right? So if you look at the numbers, you see there's a straight line up between the adoption of industrial robots in a voting district and the movement to Donald Trump. The reason why he is our president today is that we automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Missouri, Iowa, all the swing states that he needed to win and did win. How many of you are from one of those states? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. And now my friends in Silicon Valley know full well that what we did to the manufacturing workers, we are now going to do to the retail workers, the call center workers, the fast food workers, the truck drivers, and on through the economy. I don't know if that deserves applause. But I know what you mean. I think you're agreeing with me. It was just beautiful. You're getting excited. Thank you, brother. How many of you all have noticed stores closing around where you live and work? And why are they closing? Amazon, that's right. Amazon's like a giant vacuum cleaner sucking up $20 billion in business every year. And stores could hang on for a while, but now 30% of American malls and Main Street stores are going to close in the next 4 years. Now, working as a retail cashier is the most common job in the United States. The average cashier is a 39-year-old woman making between $10 and $11 an hour. And what is that cashier going to do when her mall or store closes? Vote for Andrew Yang. That's a possibility. How many of you saw the recent Google AI demo where they showed software that could handle customer service calls? You guys see that demo? What do you think the time frame is on AI being able to outperform a call center worker? What do you guys think? Literally tomorrow is what he's yelling here. Now, I know when you call a company and get their customer service bots, you react the exact same way I do, which is just to pound those keys until you get a human. You're like, human, 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 shut up, human, 0, 0, human. I do the same thing. But we're only 3 years or so away of not being able to tell the difference between the bot and the human. In a few years, the bot's going to pick up the phone and be like, hey, how you doing? What can I do to help you? And you'd be like, oh, do this. You'd be like, sure, no problem. And you'd be like, oh, that was delightful. So we're about 3 years away from that, but there are 2.5 million call center workers in the United States right now making $14 an hour. And when AI can outperform one of them, it can outperform tens, hundreds of thousands of them. Now, I talk a lot about truckers. Driving a truck is the most common job in 29 states in this country. There are 3.5 million truck drivers, 94% men, average age 49. So the person you think of as a truck driver, that's actually a truck driver. Now, my friends in Silicon Valley are working on trucks that can drive themselves, and they're doing it for the most American of reasons. They're doing it for the money. Some people are screaming, yeah, money. I mean, I like money too. So there's $168 billion in financial incentives to try and automate away these 3.5 million truck driving jobs. Do you want to bet against $168 billion a year in financial incentives? They're getting hundreds of the smartest engineers in the country working on self-driving trucks, and they tell me that they're 5 to 10 years away. They're actually testing robot trucks in the Midwest right now. Now, how do you think the truck drivers are going to take it when they start seeing robot trucks like passing them on the highways? There are dozens of truck drivers that recently protested in Indiana. They did something called a slow roll, which is they just drove their truck slowly while in a highway, and then the drivers behind them were like, what the heck is going on? Why are these trucks going so slow? Now, what were they protesting? They were protesting the digital monitoring of their driving time. They didn't like the fact that they were being digitally monitored, because right now there's a 14-hour restriction on driving a truck. After 14 hours, you have to turn the truck off or the truck starts getting mad at you. Now, how are they going to react when they're competing against robot trucks that never need to stop? I have a feeling that they're going to take it very, very poorly, and only 13% of truckers are unionized today. So we're talking about very, very dramatic transformations in our economy. And I came here to Washington, D.C. in 2017 after Donald Trump won, and I said, what are we going to do about the fact that we're in the midst of this fundamental transformation that's brought us Donald Trump? This is called the fourth. This is before I was running, so they couldn't have said vote Yang, though I love that. That's a beautiful message. That's what you all are going to say. So I came to this town, Washington, D.C., and I said, what are we going to do? And what do you all think the responses I got here in D.C. were when I said, shout them out, go ahead. So the responses I got from Washington, D.C. were these. Number one, we cannot talk about that. Boo. Number 2, we should study that further. And number 3, we must educate and retrain all Americans for the jobs of the future. So that one, you're like, wow, that sounds pretty reasonable. But again, I looked at the numbers. What do you all think the success rate was for federally funded retraining programs to the manufacturing workers in the Midwest? It was 0 to 15%. That stuff does not work. And so then I said, hey guys, I did the math and we're terrible at retraining. They actually said to me, well, I guess we'll somehow get better at it. That's a Washington, D.C. solution to a problem. I guess we'll get better. And there was one meeting I had, and I had a staffer with me, I had a colleague with me, and I thank God for it, because if I told you this and he wasn't there to verify it, you'd be like, no way that happened, but it happened. He said to me, this official said to me, Andrew, you're in the wrong town. No one in this town is going to do anything about the problems that you described, because this town is a town of followers, not leaders. And the only way for us to do something about it is if you bring a wave crashing down on our heads, and that's the only way we'll wake up. Oh, it's coming! And I looked at that, and I didn't say this, but I thought these 2 words, challenge accepted. So now I'm running for president. How many of you saw that I'm polling at 3% nationwide as of today? That's right, and most people have still never heard of Andrew Yang. When they find out about me, oh my gosh. We're just gonna keep on climbing. The internet has me as 5th most likely to win the nomination, and we know the internet is very, very smart. So why is that? I'm proposing, as you heard, I'm proposing the Freedom Dividend, which is $1,000 a month for every American adult starting at age 18. That's right. Now, the first time you heard of that, what you thought was these 3 things. There's an Asian man running for president who wants to give everyone $1,000 a month. And all those 3 things are true. But at first, when you heard them, you were like, this literally sounds fantastic. This sounds too good to be true. This almost sounds like a gimmick. But then when you look into our history, you realize this idea has been with us since the founding of this country. Thomas Paine was for it. At the founding, he called it the Citizens' Dividend. Martin Luther King, whose birthday we celebrate every year, was for it. He called it the Guaranteed Minimum Income, and he championed it in the year 1967, the year before he was assassinated. Milton Friedman and 1,000 economists signed a study saying this would be tremendous for America. Well, Milton Friedman gets some applause. That's the Yang Gang for you. It was so mainstream that it passed the U.S. House of Representatives twice in 1971. And then 11 years later, one state adopted a dividend where now everyone in that state gets between $1,000 and $2,000 a year, no questions asked. And what state is that? Alaska! And how do they fund it? Oil! And what is the oil of the 21st century? Technology, that's right. What they're doing for Alaska with oil money, we can do for everyone here and everyone around the country with technology money. In Alaska, they call it the oil check, and they love it, and we're going to call this the tech check, and we're going to love it. Oh, with $1,000 a month, and I want you to think, what would you all do with $1,000 a month? Where would that money go? It would go to college for a lot of the young people here. We got to get the cost of college down, pay off the debts, credit card bills, but it would stay in your local communities. You would end up spending it on food, bills, health care, the occasional night out, and a lot of that would circulate over and over again in the towns and neighborhoods you live in. This is the trickle-up economy, from people, families, and communities up. This is the freedom dividend. It will make us stronger, healthier, mentally healthier. And I will say, if the Democratic Party is going to talk about empowering women, we all know that there are millions of women around the country that are in abusive or exploitative jobs or relationships because they lack the economic freedom to walk away. And $1,000 a month would help that a great deal. Am I right? We can either talk about empowering women or we can do something about it, and I choose to do something about it. So this is the freedom dividend. This is how we can build an economy that works for us, and there is nothing stopping the majority of citizens of a democracy in declaring ourselves a dividend. Nothing at all. We just need to wake up to that power that we have as Americans. And you all are going to help us wake up the rest of the country, and I thank you for that. So we can't stop there. The second thing is we have to get health care off of your backs. Now, looking at you all, you're young, you're beautiful, a lot of you are in perfect health. You don't understand where it's going to go, where health care right now is this massive weight on millions of families and individuals, where if you get sick or injured, you're more stressed out about navigating our crazy labyrinth of a healthcare system than you are actually getting healthy or getting well. And that's messed up, that's immoral, and we can change it. We can move towards a public option to make it so that if you get sick or injured in the richest and most advanced country in the world, you will not have to worry about your bills. I know that sounds too good to be true, but I've looked at the numbers. We spend 18% of our GDP to worse results than other countries. And so whenever anyone's looking around being like, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? Are you kidding me? Like, I've run companies, and I'll tell you, we're spending a ton of money on health insurance. Because, like, when you're running a company, it's a disincentive to hire someone. It's a disincentive to change jobs. It's a disincentive to start a business. How many of you have wanted to change jobs or start a business, but then you were like, what am I going to do about my health care? How many of you have had that experience? Yeah, this is going to unleash the dynamism and the entrepreneurship of the American people to get health care off of our backs. And the third thing, I like to ask this question, how many of you get excited about GDP when you wake up in the morning? You know, and I talk about my wife who's at home with our 2 young boys, one of whom is autistic. What is her work valued at in GDP every day? 0. What does the market value her work at? 0. And we know that's nonsense. We know the work that she's doing is more important, more vital, more challenging than a lot of the other work that's being done in our country. So we're going to follow GDP right now off a cliff because self-driving trucks are going to be great for GDP, but they're going to be terrible for a lot of people. So how do we shift to an economy that we'd actually be excited about? We have to change the measurements. So instead of GDP, this phantom number that we made up almost 100 years ago, and even the inventor of GDP said 3 things. He said, 1, this is a terrible measurement for national well-being and we should never use it as that. Number 2, he said, we should include parenthood because it's so important. And number 3, we should not include national defense spending because it adds no economic value. Now we ignore all of those things and we worship this GDP number that he made up almost 100 years ago. So instead of GDP, what should we be focusing on? How about our own health and mental health? How about how clean our air and water are? How about average income and affordability? So these are the problems of this era. GDP is at a record high. Meanwhile, our life expectancy has actually gotten shorter for the past 3 years. And our life expectancy has gotten shorter because drug overdoses and suicides have overtaken vehicle deaths as cause of death in this country for the first time in our history. You know the last time our life expectancy declined 3 years in a row? The Great Flu Pandemic of 1918, the Spanish flu. That's the last time our life expectancy declined for 3 years in a row. And yet we're celebrating this GDP that means nothing to us while our people are dying earlier. So we have to shift the measurements to something that will actually reflect how we're doing. And as president, I'm going to reflect on these numbers. I'm going to present them every year at the State of the Union. I'm going to have a PowerPoint deck. I'm going to be the first president to use PowerPoint at the State of the Union. That's right. You're going to actually get something out of the State of the Union instead of these bizarre theater performances we're subject to every year. And then people are all trying to stand up and clap and not clap. Like, what is this? It's so weird. Numbers, that's right. I'm going to show the numbers. So this is how we can advance to the next stage of our economy. You know, people are looking, the number one criteria for Democrats right now in a presidential candidate is who can beat Donald Trump. And we all know here in the Yang Gang that our campaign is already getting former Trump supporters, independents, Republicans, libertarians, Democrats, and progressives. We're going to build a coalition that's going to sweep the floor, mop the floor with Donald Trump. Am I right? Yeah. Now, Donald Trump is our president today because he got a lot of the fundamental problems right. He did. You have to say, when he was going around saying, hey, things are not great, and then the counter was things actually are great, like that was not the right response. There are real problems on the ground, and he got that much right, but unfortunately his solutions are the opposite of what we need. His solutions are that we have to turn the clock back, we have to build a wall, we have to try and... Yes. And time only moves in one direction. I want to do the opposite of Donald Trump. I want to accelerate our economy and society. I want to prepare us for the true challenges of the 21st century, and I'm the right man for the job because the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian man who likes math. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Washington, D.C. I love you all. Chant my name. Chant my name. Thank you all. You're all amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. I'm coming your way. Thank you. I'm going to come in and mix it up. Thank you. Yes. 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 Thank you all. Thank you. It's good to see you again. Thank you. No problem. Thanks, guys, for being here. All right. I'm going to back up.
Andrew Yang! Andrew Yang! Andrew Yang! Andrew Yang! Andrew Yang! Andrew Yang! Woo!
Tonight on The Communicators, from the State of the Net conference in Washington, D.C., we speak with Daphne Keller of Stanford Law School on speech restrictions on media platforms.
Anytime a company goes into a country that's like a lucrative market and that's now going to have leverage over the platform, you're running the risk that that country is going to tell you to censor things or tell you to invade your users' privacy or turn over data to the police. And that absolutely happens with countries all over the world. It's not unique to China.
Watch The Communicators tonight at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN 2.
And a look at our primetime schedule on the C-SPAN networks. Starting at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN, a discussion on race, diversity, and politics with former Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa. At 8:30 Eastern on C-SPAN 2, it's Book TV, with books and authors who've written about politics. And at 8 p.m. on C-SPAN 3, American History TV, with the annual Abraham Lincoln Symposium, which highlights the life and legacy of America's 16th president.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live every day with news and policy issues that impact you. Coming up Tuesday morning, a discussion about the future of healthcare with Julie Rovner of Kaiser Health News. And then we'll talk about the rising cost of insulin with Christelle Marchand-Apriliano of the Diabetes Patient Advocacy Coalition. Be sure to watch C-SPAN's Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern Tuesday morning. Join the discussion.
And tomorrow, journalists discuss the relationship between the U.S. intelligence community and the press. The event, hosted by George Mason University, live Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN. Also tomorrow, C-SPAN's Road to the White House coverage continues, with remarks by New Jersey Senator and Democratic presidential candidate Cory Booker. He'll speak to voters and supporters at the Democratic Party Black Caucus Town Hall in Des Moines, Iowa. Live Tuesday at 8:45 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN.
Once, TV was simply 3 giant networks and a government-supported service called PBS. Then, in 1979, a small network with an unusual name rolled out a big idea. Let viewers decide, all on their own, what was important to them. C-SPAN opened the doors to Washington policymaking for all to see, bringing you unfiltered content from Congress and beyond. In the age of power to the people, this was true people power. In the 40 years since, the landscape has clearly changed. There's no monolithic media, broadcasting has given way to narrowcasting, YouTube stars are a thing. But C-SPAN's big idea is more relevant today than ever. No government money supports C-SPAN. Its nonpartisan coverage of Washington is funded as a public service by your cable or satellite provider. On television and online, C-SPAN is your unfiltered view of government, so you can make up your own mind.
All this afternoon, politicians have been tweeting about the fire that damaged Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi posted, "Notre Dame Paris has stood as a beating heart of religion and culture for centuries, inspiring all who have visited her. The footage of today's fire is nothing short of heartbreaking. To the people of Paris and France, know that America stands with you." Vice President Pence tweeted, "Notre Dame is an iconic symbol of faith to people all over the world, and it is heartbreaking to see a house of God in flames. Our thoughts and prayers are with the firefighters on the scene and the people of Paris." And First Lady Melania Trump says, "My heart breaks for the people of Paris after seeing the fire at Notre Dame Cathedral, praying for everyone's safety."
Day 2019, we continue the conversation in this hour, focusing a bit more on ways to improve the U.S. tax system. Helping us do that are 2 guests, Jason Fichtner, who is a fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and we'll take a look at some of their recommendations for improving taxes. And also joining us is Jeffrey Trinka, who is Vice President at Van Scoik Associates. Gentlemen, the idea of a postcard size tax return came up in comments from Kevin Brady and others at the passage of the law. Whatever happened to the tax postcard?
Oftentimes reality gets in the way of ideology. We would love to go to a point where we could do taxes on a postcard. But the U.S. tax system is designed right now to basically have a lot of social engineering in the tax code. We do a lot of things for child tax credits, earned income tax credits, a variety of rates and deductions. We have small business income. We have complexity in our daily code. The more complexity you have, the harder it is to get that form smaller. And so we basically can't put it on a postcard unless we get to the point where we have something like a flat tax or a very, very broad base with very, very low rates.
Jeff Rutschenka.
Well, they have a postcard. I mean, they have it down to half a page. Unfortunately, most of our printers print out on a 8 by 3 11. So what you have now is a bunch of awkward schedules that come after it. It's going to be interesting to see as people apply for their student loans and their mortgages, and they're dealing with forms that they're unfamiliar with. But in reality, people go to practitioners, people they use software for self-help, and they don't actually see the form. You know, you get essentially a interview, and then at the end you print. So I was kind of surprised at the end when I actually printed it out, and I said, oh, okay, well, this is what it looks like. I spent half a day doing my taxes, and I hadn't actually even seen the form.
We'll take a look at some of the recommendations from the Bipartisan Policy Center in a second, but what do you think, if you looking at this tax law, what are a couple of the ways that still it could be simplified further and the whole process could be improved that's not been done under this tax law?
Well, Jason and I, we might have different ideas along that. I mean, I'm more of a tax collection purist, I guess. The more social welfare that we try to push into the tax code, the more complex it is. So if you're helping low-income folks through the IRS, if you're encouraging people to use electric cars, if you're encouraging them to invest earlier, then that's going to add complexity. If you had a situation where you had one or two rates, and the IRS's main job was essentially just to collect taxes, it would be a much simpler system. But if we're going to have a system that does these social welfare programs in the Internal Revenue Code, you're always going to have complexity.
And Jason Fichtner, we're looking at the report from your Bipartisan Policy Center, the Tax Administration Report on Compliance, Complexity, and Capacity, just released ahead of tax deadline day today. And part of that includes providing adequate funding in terms of the IRS, simplifying and consolidating tax credits for low and moderate income filers, improving the IRS hiring and training process, more oversight of tax return preparers, and strengthening the service programs such as volunteer tax preparation. Do you feel that some of these things weren't addressed under the 2017 law?
Yeah, I think this is important first to point out that the Bipartisan Policy Report was a co-authorship between myself, Jeff, and Bill Gale at the Brookings Institution. And the three of us have a lot of years working in tax policy, tax administration. I've worked for the IRS. Jeff was part of the Restructuring Reform Committee as Chief of Staff. So we bring a lot of experience to this. And the thing with the 2017 law is it was designed from a policy standpoint to try to get a lot of various different political votes. You have to pass it. And to Jeff's point, we agree 100% on this. The more things you put into the tax code to give certain favors or breaks, the narrowing you're making the tax base. When you narrow the tax base, you have to raise the marginal rates to raise revenue. What we'd like to see is a broader base where you don't have all these deductions and exemptions, but then have much lower tax rates to raise the revenue you need. And what we saw with 2017 is a lot of these programs and administrations and policies were put in place without sort of consultation with the IRS about how could you administer this. And this led to a problem you've seen this year, where a lot of people are now filing their taxes today, and they quote unquote owe money, and they're wondering where their refund is. And they incorrectly assume that their taxes have gone up. What happened is their taxes were lowered, and they got more back in their paycheck each year. Their withholding was lower. And so they get to the end of the year and they owe money, and that seems like make them think they actually owe taxes, and they didn't get a tax break. They did get a tax break, but their withholding was lower. So we traded off the idea of, do you want more money in your paycheck now, or do you want less and get a refund? And that created confusion, and the IRS rushed out the withholding tables.
Yeah, it was pointed out in the last segment that the lateness of the passing of the law late in 2017 meant the IRS was scrambling quite a bit to get the withholding guidelines and tables together.
Yeah, I mean, actually they haven't come out with the redesigned W-4 yet. What they did was they juggled the schedules around for businesses, and that added a lot of confusion for folks. You know, they may not have noticed that extra $50, $100 in their paycheck each time, but and then others, you know, in high tax, state tax states, they're going to see a difference. Now that difference may be a tax increase, but in some situations not. When you've taken away some deductions, but you've also lowered and redone the rates. So it's hard to tell until you do it.
Our guests are Jeffrey Trinka and Jason Fichtner, rather, with the Bipartisan Policy Institute. We're talking about ways to improve the tax system on this tax day 2019. I'd like to hear your stories this year and your thoughts on doing that. Republicans use 202-748-8000. Democrats 202-748-8001. And for all others, outlined is 202-748-8002. You can also send us a tweet at C-SPAN WJ. The report that both of you have done on the tax system, if you had to take one thing that the 2017 law does that simplifies the system the best, what would you say that is?
The rate reductions, I think, were a vast improvement because as an economist, what really drives people's behavior is the marginal rates, and lowering the rates was very fantastic and good for simplicity, and increasing the standard deduction.
Yeah. That's the you caught me. Increasing the standard deduction means fewer people are itemizing. When fewer people are itemizing, it's just a simpler system. But you know, we keep going back to the tax law. I think a really important issue is the IRS's budget. You know, so the IRS has seen a huge decrease in their budget over the last decade at every level, at service, at compliance. So, you know, are people being able to get through when they have questions? Are walk-in centers still open? I mean, those are VITA programs available to folks. I mean, those are the real questions that a lot of folks have. And then are people paying their fair share? Do they have the resources to audit high income and corporations?
Do you feel like right now we don't have those resources?
No, definitely don't. I mean, I've watched the IRS, you know, did oversight in the 80s for the Senate, the Restructuring Commission in the 90s. They have fewer people, much larger economy, a lot more taxpayers, but they have a lot fewer people than they did even 10 years ago, like 30,000 people. You should have probably seen a growth in the agency to maintain audit levels, to maintain collection levels, to provide for walk-in resources for folks, because you know some people, they don't mind getting on the computer, but other people, they need to go, they need to bring their shoebox in and talk to a real person.
And to dovetail on Jeff, so when I worked for the IRS in the mid-90s in the Clinton administration, there were roughly about 100,000 IRS employees. Today we're about 72,000. Doesn't mean you can't be more efficient and you can't do more with less, but you're getting to the point now where the IRS is going to do less with less. And so we have to be strategic in how we do staffing. But if you want someone to answer your phone calls when you have questions, if you want to be able to walk into a site, that requires staffing. It can't be done automatically. And so we have to be strategic about how we put resources into the Internal Revenue Service.
Talking about ways to improve the U.S. tax system, welcome your calls and comments. Republicans 202-748-8001. For Democrats 202-748-8000. And for all others 202-748-8002. We'll go to Belmont on our Democrats line. La Crosse, Wisconsin. Go ahead.
Okay, I was wondering why if you have a daughter or son that is 17 years old, why you wouldn't qualify for that $2,000 tax credit, which I didn't qualify for, because they're more expensive at 17 than they're at 12 or 13. So that was my question.
What's the cutoff age?